Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome to the Occupy Fantasy Football Podcast, Week 13 edition. The season's flying by, and we're here with another episode with a crazy week. I'm Brian Jester, co-founder here at Occupy Fantasy, your co-host of this show. I'm joined today, as always, by our NFL Daily Plug writer and my co-host here, Chris Rooney. Happy Football Wednesday to you, Chris.
Yes, I'm looking forward to an appropriately timed kickoff here so we can get out of the Ravens-Steelers game, finally finish week 12, Brian, and get ready for the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree lighting ceremony, because apparently that's what takes precedence here in 2020. What a year. What a season. Anyway, that's enough of that. How are you doing today?
I'm good, man. Yeah, it's been a really weird week timing wise, and we're trying to get all the content out to everyone. And you and I were just talking before the show. We got games coming up soon.
Yeah.
We have a weird 3-game Monday through
Yep.
Tuesday slate next week. All kinds of crazy stuff going on. But we're here for this episode to look at what we know as of now for the Week 13 main slate on Sunday. And like we do every single week in the show, we'll talk about injuries from the previous week, talk about some backfields that have had some changes in recent games, look at the Week 13 slate from a high level, talk about the betting market's biggest favorites, biggest totals, what's that mean for our lineups. Then, of course, we'll get into the good stuff, the underperforming receivers for this week, tight ends to target, and, of course, Chris's famous game stacks. So, Chris, if we look at Week 12, you actually told me before the show, is this right? Because it's kind of light on injuries, not a ton of things that we have to talk about.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, I guess the most impactful one, we'll just jump right in, is quarterback situation with the New York Giants. Daniel Jones nursing a little bit of a hamstring injury. I've seen some conflicting stuff on this where, they seem to think he'll miss some time. They're not sure if that just means practice time or a game or two here. I'm leaning towards we'll see Colt McCoy on Sunday. What do you think?
Yeah, it sounds like that to me too. And maybe this was a game to potentially target for stacks against Seattle, but not with Colt McCoy and not with the let Russ cook movement being turned into more of like a let Russ simmer or like casually bake movement, because they're not throwing as much as they have been, at least to start the season. So not necessarily a game that we're looking forward to. A couple of running back injuries we want to talk about. Josh Jacobs, who has played through a variety of ailments both this year and last year, proving his toughness. So I imagine we'll see him out there on Sunday, but he did bang up his ankle. Didn't play him much in the late in that Atlanta game, but they were also losing by about 50 points. But if somehow he is out, we could get a nice little cheap backup running back in Devontae Booker.
Yeah, and Booker has looked good in limited work. So anytime we get, that bump in usage for running back at a lower price, it causes us to look at it a little closer. Obviously, early in the week here, Wednesday morning, we're not going to know for a couple of days here. So we'll revisit that. We'll want to look at the Raiders backfield if Josh Jacobs does in fact miss the game. A backfield that I know we didn't even look at last week because that game was bizarre. The Denver Broncos. Philip Lindsay, I guess, is hurt with a knee injury again. So is it Melvin Gordon time, Brian? Are we even interested in going back to the Broncos? Sounds like we'll get a real quarterback here in week 13 from them. I think this is a showdown slate specific, obviously, point of discussion right here, though.
Yeah, shout out to Kendall Hinton for his performance stepping in on Sunday for the Broncos. Yeah, it sounds like all their tests came back negative, so we'll get Drew Lock back in the mix. But Melvin
Perfect.
Gordon, just for this game, if you're playing it, he got 83% of the running back touches when Lindsey missed weeks 2 through 4 with that toe injury. Most notably, had that big game against the Jets on that showdown slate. So, yeah, if you're playing the showdown slate, I think Gordon definitely gets a bump in usage if Lindsey does miss the game. Probably the biggest news of the entire week was Will Fuller, who has stayed healthy for the entire year. I'm not going to speculate if this is why he stayed healthy the entire year, but he's been suspended for 6 games, violating the performance enhancement policy, performance enhancing drug policy,
Yeah.
PEDs. Yeah, so he's out. Randall Cobb, still not sure of his status yet, but with Fuller out, they did cut Kenny Stills last week. Maybe a reunion makes sense, Chris, but this has to be good for definitely Brandon Cooks and our boy Kiki Kuti.
No, absolutely. We got QT who should obviously play a little bit more without any receivers ahead of him really on the depth chart. Big loss, just to put numbers behind it. Will Fuller, a 31% share of Deshaun Watson's air yards in recent weeks. That's probably right in line with about what it was all year. A little bit of right around 25% of the targets. That's a big chunk of the opportunity in this offense that needs to be replaced. Um, and we're not sure where it's going to go. It could be Kiki QT. There's also a couple of other deeper wide receivers on the roster, Steven Mitchell and rookie Isaiah Coulter. So we may be getting a little more familiar with them in the coming days, Brian. And then we also have, getting ahead of ourselves in the agenda here, one of their tight ends, I think, might actually play potentially more. Jordan Akins has been running a lot of routes out of the slot. And I know that you and I, when we were discussing this, I think it was yesterday, we might actually even see a little bit of 12 personnel out of the Texans. Maybe they'll utilize both Darren Fells and Jordan Akins a little bit more. We will have to see. One thing that is coming up for them that may help lift their spirits a little bit after losing some of their best players. David Johnson is eligible to return from injured reserve. Sounds like folks inside of Texans camp are optimistic about him in week 13, but because he is on injured reserve, they actually do not have to list him on the injury report, Brian. So I'm not sure we're going to get much clarity there for a few days.
Okay, yeah, that's definitely something to monitor. David Johnson comes back. Maybe we get our dream opportunity, and Duke Johnson plays more receiver, and we get him as a running back if all these things shake out. I will say the coaches were pretty pessimistic early about David Johnson. He was placed on injured reserve like 3 days after a concussion, which is pretty worrisome. But yeah, that's definitely something we'll want to monitor moving forward here in Week 13. Let's talk about some other backfields. I think some interesting usage to discuss, Chris, from Week 12. Let's start with the Chargers. Austin Eckler. Most people didn't expect him really to come back this first week of his eligibility, but he did, and wasn't limited in any capacity whatsoever.
No, and this usage, I know everybody's focusing on the 25 touches, which is, in fact, a career high for him. But this usage is actually right in line with what he was seeing at the beginning of the season. It's right in line with what he was seeing last year when Melvin Gordon was not participating in football for the Chargers. So this is who Austin Eckler is. I mean, he is a usage hog, as we say, and he gets a ton of really chances to make good things happen when he gets the ball in his hands. He's a very dynamic player. We're going to be using him heavily here the rest of the way, I think, especially in PPR formats, just because you can't look at what he gets in the passing game. 14 targets last week. I mean, if we're going to see that week in and week out, Austin Eckler is going to be one of our top running backs in DFS. Coming up, a matchup with the Patriots. I don't think that is one that should scare us here. I think Austin Eckler is someone we should be looking at.
Absolutely. Let's go to Atlanta, and very predictably, Brian Hill failed in his role as the lead back with Todd Gurley out. It's kind of tough to figure out what's going on with Gurley. We have to monitor practice reports this week, but head coach or interim coach Raheem Morris said he had some war wounds or battle wounds or something along those lines, a knee injury, which is never good because he's had a knee injury in the past and he has the arthritis, which could flare up at any time, and maybe that's what this is. Not going to speculate, but without Gurley, Brian Hill actually split touches pretty evenly with Ito Smith, as we thought that might happen. Quadri Allison was out, so it was just those two running backs in the game. So if Gurley does miss moving forward, it doesn't look like we have a true back that we can rely on.
No, and you got to wonder, Brian, a little bit if just thinking about the bigger context of what's going on in the NFL, not just our kind of little DFS bubble here. Are the Falcons almost kind of shifting into an evaluation mode here? I believe Gurley only signed a 1-year contract. They're not going anywhere this postseason. They're not even going to be in this postseason. So are they trying to figure out, again, what's going on with Brian Hill, Ito Smith, maybe even Kadri Allison as kind of the weeks march on here? There are going to be teams, and Atlanta may be one of them, where we need to start being skeptical of what the usage will look like, not just at running back, but at all the positions as they start to look to 2021. The Seattle Seahawks, Brian, they had Carlos Hyde and Chris Carson back in action on Monday night. Carlos Hyde was causing a lot of people some anxiety on Monday night. I know, at least in our staff Slack chat, I know some of you guys that were pretty heavily invested in Chris Carson's showdown single game slate were pretty upset with that. But I would say it's definitely surprising Carlos Hyde played as much as he did over Chris Carson, 41 snaps to just 25 for Carson. Even though Carson got in the end zone, had a pretty nice game in the box score. Are we worried about this? Were they maybe just trying to manage Carson's reps in his first game back? Like, how do you feel about this right now?
Yeah, my gut is that they were just managing reps. I mean, Carson clearly looked like the better back just from the eye test. And this is his first week off a foot injury, which is something you can't really condition while you're rehabbing. It's not a
Mhm.
shoulder, it's not a concussion or whatever it may be. So I have the feeling that he wasn't in full football shape and as a result didn't get his full workload. If this happens again next week against the Giants, against the Giants, maybe we have something to be concerned about. I have a feeling it's going to turn around though. The backfield I'm not sure about is San Francisco. So they got Raheem Mostert back this week. They got Jeff Wilson back. Just absolute complete mess. Mostert got 40% of the snaps against the Rams. Jeff Wilson 35%. McKinnon battling his tired leg still got 25%. So like a true three-headed backfield.
Yeah, and I want to say that Jeff Wilson comes in and maybe they're using him more on passing downs than Mostert, but Wilson had 0 targets in that game against the Rams for them. So maybe that's still McKinnon. I think you hit the nail on the head. This is just extremely messy. What we can say with confidence is that they do seem to think Mostert is at the top of their depth chart. He's playing on all the early downs, and obviously playing the most snaps reflects that. So of the three, Brian, he's the one that I feel quote unquote the best about, but I don't feel good about any of them right now. And I think, that's really it from a high level backfield situation that we wanted to talk about today, things we were looking forward to learning in week 12 that we've sort of figured out. So, as far as the betting markets are concerned, early look here into week 13. Miami Dolphins, Brian, huge favorites against the now Joe Burrow-less Cincinnati Bengals in their second game, I think, with Brandon Allen. We got the Minnesota Vikings getting 9.5 points over the Jacksonville Jaguars and the giraffe himself, Mike Glennon. We have the Packers getting 9 points over. Sorry, I had to take a second here. The Philadelphia Eagles, who are somehow still quarterbacked by Carson Wentz. And we have the Raiders getting a touchdown and 7.5 points over the New York Jets, despite looking like the worst team in football last week. So those are some of the big ones. We were just talking about Seattle backfield. The Seahawks are also 7.5 point favorites over the Giants. Anything stand out to you in this group? Any specific team that you're looking forward to playing in DFS this week based off of their favorite status?
First thing I noticed is a lot of bad teams being really big favorites this week. It's kind of Miami, Minnesota. Not bad teams, but not your typical really good teams
Right.
in big favorite situation. Miami, Minnesota, the Raiders. So kind of interesting. And as always, you talk about in the daily play, we like to play big favorites at running back. Should get more touches, have better chances for scoring. So the backfields to monitor this week for that: Myles Gaskin. Maybe he's back off injured reserve. They had a pretty messy backfield with both him and Ahmed out last week. The Vikings' big favorites. Let's monitor Dalvin Cook. We didn't talk about him in the injury section because he did return to that game, but he did bust up his ankle a little bit. So let's monitor that as Minnesota are big favorites. We talked about Jacobs as a big favorite. Maybe we get Booker in a spot. Talked about Carson and Hyde already. So kind of tough situations with some of these injuries this early in the week. The only one I think we could rely on, pretty easily is Aaron Jones. But then again, Jamal Williams is probably going to vulture him at some point anyways.
Devontae Adams, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of that, and that's a nice segue, and maybe this is too weighty of a subject, frankly, for this episode of this podcast. Maybe we can get into this in some future content and different avenues, different platforms. But I'm starting to wonder a little bit, Brian, about whether or not we need to start thinking about DFS differently. In fact, I mean, we probably always should be thinking about DFS differently, trying to learn and grow and play optimally at all times. Is playing large favorite running backs that are super expensive still the way to go here? We just, and I know this might be a little bit of recency bias, but we're coming off of a week where Tyreek Hill, DK Metcalf, these are receivers that are typically priced in the sevens to low eights that have access to these astronomical ceilings based off how they're being used by their quarterbacks. We don't have very many running backs that are in that 8 to 9K range on either FanDuel or DraftKings, frankly, as much anymore. I don't know. I was thinking about this morning. I kind of wanted to talk about it with you. You're usually pretty sharp with this stuff. Do you see a scenario where maybe we start looking more towards these mid-range price running backs that have fairly predictable usage, running those guys and trying to get up to the best receivers more often, especially in low risk contests? Because I don't think this is something that most sharp, low risk cash game players have been doing for years. But I kind of feel like this is where the game is headed, frankly.
It's not the worst idea in the world. And you say I'm usually sharp, keyword usually, so I appreciate that. It's interesting to think about because what's the whole idea of low risk contests? We have to eliminate risk, guarantee touches. But if you think about it, it's 2020, and we've talked about many times how cash games, low risk contests are extremely difficult in NFL because the access to good projections is so widespread. Like you can
Mhm.
go anywhere. We talk about projections not mattering that much. The reality is you can go to ESPN, get free projections. You can go to your most favored, behind the paywall content DFS site.
Mhm.
You can go to Fantasy Pros and get consensus. The projections aren't going to differ that much because the way people have access to information now, a lot of them are going to be similar. So, all that being said, right? A lot of cash game lineups are going to look pretty similar. People can figure out the best plays, the best volume plays. Maybe we need a little more ceiling in those lineups, especially in head-to-heads, right? When you're playing just one opponent. So I don't mind this idea at all, especially if you're still backing it up with the idea that you are guaranteeing volume. So maybe you're guaranteeing 15 to 20 touches from someone like Wayne Gallman, who you put in the show notes here, as opposed to guaranteeing 20 to 25 touches from Dalvin Cook because it does give you a higher ceiling lineup, especially if you can play someone like whether it's Tyreek Hill or Keenan Allen or even a little bit lower Justin Jefferson, and not dropping down to guys like Denzel Mims or 3K
Yeah.
receivers. So I see what you're saying here. I think it probably makes sense.
I I think we're going to be talking about this a lot for the rest of this season and in future seasons to come, quite frankly. All across the industry, people are probably going to start thinking about this more. I think you hit the nail on the head just to keep it about week 13. That's what the people are here for. Wayne Gallman, I think, is in a good spot this week for the New York Giants, just purely based on his usage. His price is still super affordable. He's getting all of the red zone opportunities at running back right now. So we got to like that. Even better potentially. I know people do not like playing him, especially in classic slates, but David Montgomery, just 5,500 this week on DraftKings, finally broke a yard for over 3 yards, broke a run for over 3 yards this past week. So maybe he can keep doing that for us. Like I said, I think we might start looking at more of these types of plays so we can get to these receivers that project for 10, 11, and 12 targets because I mean, Brian, it's not like there's just a handful of guys that are in that arena anymore. There's a lot of receivers that are approaching those types of projections, and I think this might be where we start heading. Anyway,
Real quick,
highest totals.
real quick,
Go
Chris, I
ahead.
do want to add one more thing to that. You have to think about the state of the game too, right? As analytics become more involved and teams are passing more over expectation, that means receivers have more opportunities than they had just a year ago or 5 years ago, especially. So it makes sense from that regard too.
Absolutely. Appreciate a little bit of a mind meld there that you were willing to engage in. Our highest total games on this slate probably will be a lot of crossover with our top game stacks. Hint, hint. The Cleveland Browns head to Nashville to head to face the Tennessee Titans. That game somehow has the highest total on the slate, 54 points. Ryan Tannehill, Baker Mayfield, not necessarily shootout quarterbacks that I would expect, but there you go. Mike Glennon and Kirk Cousins, another set of what really, but 52 points on that game. So very interesting to start off our list. A little bit of a division rivalry here. The Indianapolis Colts and the Houston Texans, 51 points. I don't think they've faced each other yet. So even though we're in December, this might still be a viable game for us to stack because it's not that dreaded second divisional matchup. My favorite in this group is going to be Jacksonville and Minnesota, Brian. I think James Robinson, we talked about him, I think, at length last week, still getting literally all of the usage at running back for the Jaguars. We're going to have to see what happens at wide receiver. I know they were a little banged up last week. I haven't seen reports on whether or not Chark, Conley are going to return. I imagine they will, but
Give us Chris
whether
Conley,
they're
please.
yeah, right. Whether they're in or out, there's going to be receivers to stack in this game on the Jacksonville side. And then with the Vikings, I mean, we obviously know it's Dalvin Cook, it's Justin Jefferson, it's hopefully Adam Thielen if we get him back. So that's my favorite game. I don't know if you've got a different take here, but I'm actually kind of liking this slate because I feel like there's a lot we can do DFS wise with these teams.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. A couple teams are off the slate, so Mahomes is obviously in the Sunday night game. We get Josh Allen on Monday. A lot of the teams we normally stack are off the main slate, so that's how you end up with guys like Baker Mayfield and Ryan Tannehill and Mike Glennon and Kirk Cousins. And for me, just thinking, I haven't looked at the full slate yet, but I imagine most people won't be stacking fully these games. I mean, we talked about it in our Tuesday night Twitch stream for those who tuned in. Like, people still aren't stacking enough 3x1 on FanDuel and DraftKings, and they're definitely not going to fully 3x1 stack teams like Cleveland and Jacksonville and Minnesota and Tennessee and maybe Indy and Houston too. So lots of opportunities here. I'm pretty excited. This looks like a good tournament week for me, which means we also have some underperforming receivers to talk about as well. So let's transition
Certainly
there.
do.
Um,
Absolutely.
go ahead, Chris. Tell me about some of these
Yeah.
guys.
No,
Obviously, because AJ Green's going to be on the list every single week. I think we can eliminate him with Brandon Allen playing at quarterback. But aside from him, we have some interesting tournament names.
Denzel Mims and Brashad Perriman, we are all in on New York Jets wide receivers. I'm still more interested in Mims right now, Brian. 431 air yards last 3 games for these Jets. No touchdowns. Still hasn't been able to score. They need to get this guy in the end zone, not just for our bankrolls, but because I'm just really excited to see it happen, frankly. Perriman has been at the top of their depth chart when he's been able to stay on the field. So will be interesting to see what the Jets do here in week 13. I think both those guys will continue to play a lot. Someone who he's not on our list, but I just kind of want to talk about it now that we're talking Jets. Someone who hasn't really done much recently, the usage is sort of evaporated, is Jameson Crowder. I think when most people think about Sam Darnold right now, other than being out with mono last year or just being straight up trash this year, Brian, they think about him honing in on Jameson Crowder. He actually hasn't done that in recent weeks. So he's going to tilt our faces off and do that again here in week 13, probably. We have Jalen Rieger with the Philadelphia Eagles, who is making an appearance on the list. I have a hard time going with any of these Eagles receivers after watching a primetime Carson Wentz disaster. He can't do it right now. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if he's always been like this. Maybe he has. He's just super inaccurate, and
That's why we play him, because everyone saw that, and no one's going to want to play Rager this week.
You're right. You're right. That's why you've got a better tournament brain than I do. What I was going to say is that's why guys like Rager, that's why guys like AJ Green, frankly, are on this list, because they deal with subpar quarterback play. So they obviously don't realize their opportunity, but they still have opportunity to realize, and that's why obviously you like them so much. We also have Mike Williams, and I know we have a lot of listeners, especially our friend Bismo, who's going to be happy to hear us talking about Mike Williams with the Los Angeles Chargers, also on the list, facing the Patriots, who, yeah, they actually did surprisingly shut down Kyler Murray. He didn't have a great game in week 12. I don't expect that to happen back to back here. This Patriots defense is not. When you hear the team name Patriots, this is not your daddy's Patriots, right? Like they are not anywhere near the same level they've been the last few years on defense. So I really like Mike Williams this week as well.
Yeah, Mike Williams, always an air yard leader, and when we get him on this list, we'd like to see it. And now, last year, kind of understood it. Phillip Rivers, deep ball wasn't there anymore, but Herbert's been balling out this year. So now we get Mike Williams on this list. That's a great opportunity. Marvin Jones, he'll take a hit with Kenny Galladay potentially coming back as well. He's on the list. And then, of course, Jerry Jeudy. He still remains on the list, which is nice because I thought he might, in theory, get dropped off the list because of the logistics of last week's game with having 0 quarterbacks. Don't worry, Jerry Jeudy's still underperforming, and assuming he gets a quarterback back this week, we can expect him to return to his near the top of the league opportunity lead that he's been seeing over the last month or so. So lots of guys to talk about.
I would just say not just with Jeudy, with really any Bronco that you might be looking at in any fantasy format over the last few weeks. Please make sure that you're like if people are facing you in head-to-heads or in season-long leagues or whatever, and they're like, well, I don't want to play Jerry Jeudy because he only had 2 targets last week, and they're ignoring the fact that they had no quarterbacks. That's how we have success here with Jerry Jeudy and company. So I'm really looking forward to that. Frankly, I think people are going to make those mistakes.
Real quick, Chris, and talking about Denver receivers dropping off this list. Remember, KJ Hamler was on this list last week, and so if we just kind of ignore last week's game, in theory, we should include KJ Hamler on this week's list as well.
Yeah, that's fair to point out. I'm glad you brought that up. I think we'll want to look at him because he comes at a significant price discount from Jeudy too. Typically, I don't think we have salaries for that slate yet, but it'll be something to monitor. Some captains potentially with the Broncos. Hint, hint. Right. Anyway, I'll leave that to you and Colin. You're the experts. The tight ends. that ran the most routes in Week 12. Top the list, no surprise here, with the hapless Philadelphia Eagles. Dallas Goedert, at this usage, 10 targets, basically targeted in about 20% of the routes that he runs. As long as Carson Wentz is under center and Zach Ertz is still sort of either banged up or washed, which seems to be 100% of the time.
Both.
Goddard's going to be the guy there. Not actually one of my favorites this week, though. I actually think that we're going to go back to the well with Darren Waller of the Las Vegas Raiders. I know it's not exciting. I know they looked horrible in one of the best matchups you can ask for against the Falcons, but now his matchup is still okay. It's a slightly below average matchup here in week 13. Still has a 21% target share, 25% air yard share from Derek Carr. It's really hard to get away from Darren Waller as the most obvious tight end on this slate, I guess. It's going to cost you to play him. 6,100 DraftKings, 7,000 FanDuel. Evan Engram. Feels like when we go back to Evan Engram in DFS, Brian, the Giants decide to go away from him with their usage because he was getting 9-10 targets a game a couple weeks back. We touted Evan Engram, said play him. He got 3 targets, did absolutely nothing useful for us in DFS. Then this past week, he gets 9 targets and has an amazing game when everybody virtually is on, Travis Kelce, Darren Waller. So Evan Engram, more like Evan Enigma here. I just came up with that live during the recording on the show. So you're welcome.
So
yeah. I like those two the most. 2 cheap tight ends I'll be focusing on that most people are going to say, what the hell are you talking about? Tyler Eifert of Bengals fame, now with the Jaguars. Just 3,000 on DraftKings. Probably going to be looking to stack this game. We have a little bit of uncertainty there with the receivers with injuries and guys returning or potentially not returning. But we know Tyler Eifert is the guy at tight end. We know we need cheap players in our stacks to potentially have success in tournaments, Brian. Tyler Eifert kind of fits both of those criteria for us here. So that's why I like him. And Jordan Akins, I think we talked about him at the beginning of the show with all of the changes with the Texans offense. I think he's going to be playable this week. I think he's going to be pretty popular, frankly, at just 2,900, especially on DraftKings. If he's going to be out there running a lot of slot routes, should see some targets. I highly doubt he's going to be held catchless for the second week in a row.
Yeah, it's such an interesting slate of tight end. Waller has pretty much disappointed the last few weeks, and I don't know if people are going to be willing to pay that price, which could be some leverage for us. Evan Engram, the big question there is Colt McCoy coming to quarterback. 3 of his 9 targets last week were from Colt McCoy, so not the worst thing in the world in the second half. And you got to remember, game script, they were up in the second half against the Bengals. They weren't throwing as much either, so that's something to keep in mind. Eifert, does his involvement change if Chark and Conley both come back? We'll see there. And then Akins, I think, is probably my favorite of the group, given Will Fuller's absence. So you kind of hinted at this earlier. Let's head to our final segment, game stacks that we want to target this week. You talked about Jacksonville, Minnesota. You talked about Cleveland and Tennessee. New England makes this list for, I think, the 3rd straight week, Chris. Obviously, we have some concerns about their desire to run the football, but they still play at a pretty fast pace, and I wouldn't let last week's game against Arizona deter us. To me, it felt like it was more of incompetence from Arizona's side than anything New England did defensively to stop them. So
you bring up the concern with New England wanting to run the football, and it's valid. I'm not going to try to sit here and argue that it's not. But we do have one thing that we like for game stack environments, Brian, which I'm pretty hopeful you won't disagree with me on. We have predictable funneled volume.
love that.
It's not high, but we do know the Patriots are going to give the football to Damian Harris, to Jacoby Myers, and to Damiere Byrd. That's pretty James White as well. That's pretty much it. That's perfect for game stacks, especially if you want to go heavier on the Charger side here and pick just one of those Patriots guys to run it back with. So that all being said, I still think that there is an opportunity with the Patriots, with people being low on them, especially Cam Newton coming off of one of his worst passing games of the season. Feel like that's going to regress a little bit. You'll see a little bit of a bump up in volume there. And all of those guys I just mentioned, I feel like they will play well when that happens. We love Austin Eckler. We love Keenan Allen. We have Mike Williams on the underperforming receiver list. We have Justin Herbert, who's probably the rookie of the year this year. This game is very stackable, in my opinion, for all those reasons I just mentioned, frankly. You got all these players that have access to, that 25 plus point ceiling, which is what we want in our tournament lineups. And I don't feel like as many people will be playing New England and the Los Angeles Chargers this week.
Dude, I love it. I love the idea. And let me bounce this off of you because I've actually done this in recent weeks. So we like the 3-by-1 game stack in tournaments. That means quarterback, two of his pass catchers, and then a player from the opposing team. For me, if we're stacking Cam, obviously you can do 2-by-1 because of his rushing ability. But
Mhm.
let's just say you're stacking him. Maybe if you're stacking this game, you only include James White, or you, maybe on both sides, but you include James White with Cam, whereas Damian Harris, who doesn't catch a ton of passes, just three catches all year, maybe you
Mhm.
only include him in game stacks when he's the one. So you have Herbert plus Keenan Allen plus Mike Williams running back with Damian Harris, and he gets all the touchdowns on New England side. What do you think of that? Not including Damian Harris, because we've talked about this before. Not pass catching backs, not with their quarterbacks, but including both White and Harris, but use them differently depending on how you stack the game.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the Patriots, if you're building a Cam heavy stack, you're anticipating he's going to be passing more. And if he's doing that, then it's more probable to be James White over Damian Harris. So I'm definitely intrigued by the thought. I think I have to wrestle with that a little bit more before I'm willing to kind of put it in my own lineups. But I do like what you're saying. And on the other side, when you're not necessarily as worried about it, right? If you're stacking the Chargers, you just know Harris is going to get volume, and that's all you're concerned with getting in your lineup. So, definitely interesting. Definitely something to think about. There's definitely other teams in the NFL that this situation comes up. So why don't we kind of put a pin in that, and we'll probably talk about this again over the last month or so of the season here. I'm sure that it will be an important discussion point, particularly with game stacks. So again, just to wrap it up, we like at this early juncture in the week, so this could change by the time the daily plug comes out on Friday at occupyfantasy.com. We like the Jaguars at the Vikings, the Patriots at the Chargers, the Browns at the Titans. Those are the games I'm on right now. We'll see if that changes by Friday, Brian.
What a sick set of games. You got to love it.
Yep.
So, if you enjoyed this discussion that we had earlier about cash game lineups and then just now about game stacks and tournament theory and lineup construction ideas, you'll definitely want to tune into our Twitch streams on Tuesday night, our $1 Million Mission, where I review my previous week's 150 NFL DFS lineups. We look at what winning lineups did in some of the biggest tournaments. We look at pros do with their lineups. And most importantly, we take your questions and go into detail about how to approach building tournament lineups. And the replays are available on Twitch and they're also posted on YouTube, our $1 Million Mission series. And a lot of people who tune in get a lot out of them because it's not like these shows or our Saturday shows where we just answer who should we play type questions. We get into the game theory behind it. So if you'd like that type of discussion, definitely tune into our Twitch streams, twitch.tv/Occupy Fantasy on Tuesday nights. So that'll do it for this show. Be sure to subscribe, whether you're listening to your favorite podcast app or watching the video on YouTube. For Chris, I'm Brian. Good luck in this crazy NFL scheduled week, and we'll talk to you soon.